I'm Charis Cotter, and I love ghosts. Today I'm going to tell you the story from my latest book, Footsteps in Verde, a mysterious tale with very spooky illustrations by Jenny Dwyer. This story was told to me by a wonderful Newfoundland storyteller, Brian Walsh, and I know it's a true story because he heard it from his very own mother. A long time ago, before Confederation, before electricity, when Newfoundland at night was a lot darker than it is today, there lived a little girl named Bridie. She lived in a big old house in Bay de Verde, and there was nothing she liked better than the nights when all the neighbors would come and sit around her kitchen table and tell stories. Bridie, her little sister Teresa, and her big brother John would sit in a row on the daybed, trying to be as quiet as mice, because then their mother just might forget to send them to bed. And they knew that the longer they stayed awake, the better the stories would be. They were wonderful stories. Stories about shipwrecks and pirates and murders and fairies and ghosts. There was one person in Bay de Verde who loved the stories just as much as Bridie, and his name was Poor Kay. Well, actually, his name was Jim Kay, but everyone called him Poor Kay because of his troubles. He was born with one leg shorter than the other and almost blind. So it was very hard for him to find his way through the twisting, dark paths in Bay de Verde, but somehow he always made sure he got to Bridie's house the night they were telling the stories. Just about 10 past 9, the back door would bang open, and they'd hear these peculiar footsteps coming down the hall. Step, shuffle, thump. Step, shuffle, thump. That'll be Poor Kay, someone would say. And sure enough, the kitchen door would bang open, and there be Poor Kay standing there with a great big smile on his face, come to hear the stories. One cold and rainy October, Poor Kay's troubles got even worse because he developed a cough. And he coughed and he coughed and he coughed so hard that he got sick. And then he got sicker. And he got so sick, they had to put him on a train and send him to the hospital in St. John's. He'd been gone for about 3 weeks. So stories. And was hanging around corners of the house like so many poor souls screaming to get in where it was warm. And Bridie and her little sister Teresa and her big brother John sat in a row on the daybed with their eyes as big as saucers, because tonight, for some reason, the story was better than. Just about past 9, the back door banged open, and they could hear those peculiar footsteps coming down the hall. Step, shuffle, thump. Step, shuffle, thump. That'll be Poor Kay, said Bridie's father. He must have come in on the evening train. But the kitchen door never opened. They could hear the footsteps going farther down the hall. Step, shuffle, thump. Step, shuffle, thump. And then they heard the door to the back room slowly creak open, and the footsteps shuffled in, and then the door slowly creaked shut. Oh, for goodness sake, said Bridie's mother. Where's he got to, the poor soul? He must have lost his way in the dark. Then she picked up the lamp from the table and went out in the hall, and Bridie could hear her footsteps trip-trapping down the hall. Slowly creak open, and her mother's fin, and then the door slowly creaked shut. And then there was a silence. All of a sudden, there was a terrible crash and a scream and the sound of breaking glass. And everybody jumped up and ran out into the hall, Bridie's father taking the candle from the dresser as he went. They got to the back room and they opened the door, and Bridie's father held the candle up high so they could all look in. The room was empty, except for Bridie's mother, standing in the middle of the floor, her face as white as a sheet, and the broken lamp on the floor at her feet. "What's wrong? What's happened?" said Bridie's father. "Where's poor Kay?" "He's not here," said Bridie's mother. And just at that moment, Teresa, who was only 4, gave a squeaky little scream, and their mother turned on them. "What are you youngsters doing still out of bed?" she said. "You should have been asleep hours ago." And she hustled them up the stairs. And the next thing Bridie knew, she was lying in bed, shivering in the cold between 2 clammy sheets, and her mother was taking the candle out of the room. "Oh, Mother, please don't take the candle. Don't take the candle tonight," begged Bridie. "No, Mother, don't take it," said Teresa. "What's all this foolishness?" said their mother. "You know I always take the candle." Then Bridie's brother spoke up and he said, "Mother, maybe just this once you could leave it because the girls are scared." Bridie's mother looked at her son for a moment, and then she put the candle down on the dresser. "Very well," she said, "I will leave it just this once, but mind you go straight to sleep." And then she left. Well, by this time, the wind had picked up and was howling and screeching worse than ever around the corners of the house. And Bridie lay in bed and watched the candle flicker in the draft from the wind. And the little flame would flicker and then grow and flicker and grow and send strange shadows over the ceiling and the walls of the room. Then all of a sudden, a smack of wind up against the glass, and the candle went out. Well, then Bridie did what I think I would have done if I was there, and maybe you would have done this too. She pulled the covers up over her head and lay there in a little ball, quaking with fear, until she finally fell asleep. The next morning, the whole family was sitting around the kitchen table having their breakfast, when all of a sudden the back door banged open and they heard heavy footsteps thumping down the hall. And then the kitchen door banged open, and there stood Fleming, my neighbor, at the stories. And he was out of breath, like he run all the way up the hill, and he had a little paper in his hand, but all he could do was keep shaking this piece of paper at Bridie's father and saying, "Telegram, St. John's." So Bridie's father took the piece of paper, the telegram, he opened it up and he began to read. I read, all the color drained out of his face. "Oh, Patty, what's wrong?" said his wife. He looked up and he said, "It's poor Kay. He's gone." "What do you mean he's gone?" "It says right here that poor Kay died at 10 And that's the end of my story. So thank you for listening. I love that story. It's one of my favorite Newfoundland ghost stories, partly because it's just so classic, but also because of the type of ghost it is. It's called a death token, that kind of ghost. And it's the most common ghost all throughout the world. The death token is the ghost that's most commonly seen. So if any of you are ever likely to see a ghost, I'd like to suggest that it will probably be some kind of death token. What happens is that when somebody dies, their spirit travels to wherever their loved ones are or their home is, and it seems to go there to appear to people just as a final goodbye. And that was certainly the case in the Footsteps story with poor Kay, coming to hear the stories again. Now that we've told the story of Footsteps in Beta Verde, we're going to talk to Jenny Dwyer, the illustrator. And I'm really excited about talking to Jenny about the illustrations and her artistic process, because I'm fascinated, because it's something I can't do, and I'm just fascinated about how it works. Jenny is a teacher and a visual artist, and this is actually her first picture book. So one of the things that surprised me when I started writing picture books was that I really didn't have any contact with the artist. The artist works with the publisher, and I would often either not meet the artist at all or not meet them till the end of the project. So I just wondered, Jenny, if you were surprised by this, and also if you could tell us a bit how you started out at the beginning to illustrate the book.
Yes, I would say it was definitely a challenge. So the analogy that I thought of constantly was almost as if I was an interior designer and I was going to your house and I fully decorated your entire home. And my hope and wish was that, wow, I hope she likes this. I don't know if my vision lined up with yours, but yeah, it was an interesting process, and I think most of the illustrators that I follow a lot illustrate and write their own books. So maybe I was unaware of the sort of the publishing process from this perspective, but yeah, it was eye opening. It was a challenge at times, but I think it worked out as long as you're pleased.
I I pictured in my own mind, but once you put the illustrations, because you saw it differently than I did, and I just love them. I totally love them, and I especially love that little smoky thing you did with the images coming up. That was really completely cool.
I was wondering if you remember hearing your first ghost story as a child, and maybe do you remember how old you were?
Oh yeah. Um, I can't remember really far back. What I can remember, when I was about 8 or 9, and I was at summer camp, and we used to, when the counselors would leave at night, we'd lie there and tell ghost stories. And I remember the story of the green hand. And I mean, I think there's different versions of it. But basically, it's about this green hand that is creeping and coming closer and closer. And it's outside the tent, it's coming up the stairs, and it's at the foot of your bed. And it's just like, I get scared just thinking about it. It was like the green hand was the most terrifying ghost story when I was a kid. And that's the first one I can remember. I found one of the things I really liked about your pictures was the faces of the characters. And I kept looking at them and saying, I know this guy, or I've seen this woman in Dominion and Carbonear. Like, they seem like very Newfoundland faces to me. And I just wondered what your process was, if you drew from life, from real people you knew, or if you made it up, or how that worked.
Uh, there was a lot of research and background research into finding images to use as a reference. So none of the people really exist as real people I know in my life, but I sort of took a collection and culminated images that existed through the Newfoundland archives and
Right.
different uh, Newfoundlanders and Irish tales. So old documentation imagery. A lot of the clothes and things I looked up from Theatre Newfoundland and different places. So in a sense, they do exist, and they are very much Newfoundlanders or Newfoundland people, or have relations to
Uh-huh.
our ancestors, but they weren't so much people that I know in my daily life. That would have been great if I could have had people in
Yeah.
1920s dress. But my main focus is I really wanted the children to look like siblings, because so often you see movies or different things and the kids just don't look like they could be that brother or sister
Hmm.
relation.
Hmm.
So I focused on a few characteristics and tried to push them throughout for those kids especially.
Yeah, I love the kids, especially their faces and their expressions are just completely priceless, especially the cover. I just smile when I see the cover. Every time I see it, I love that picture so much.
So I was wondering, where does your love of ghost stories come from, and what inspires these tales?
Um, well, I think my love of ghost stories comes from, I can say, I actually grew up behind a cemetery in Toronto. And it was a really old cemetery called the Necropolis, which means City of the Dead. So the cemetery was always there, and it was actually on two sides of the house. So I'd go in there to collect leaves for my leaf projects for school. And it was a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. And my sister saw ghosts there, but I didn't. And I think that that sort of framed my love of ghosts from when I was quite young. I just always felt they were around, even if I didn't see them. And I think part of my inspiration comes from my daughter Zoe, because when she was little, she saw ghosts everywhere. I've never seen a ghost, but Zoe saw them everywhere, and so did her father. And so we both got more interested in ghosts as she grew up, but she actually saw them. She's, very imaginative. And so the inspiration, but also the inspiration, of course, comes from Newfoundland and the Newfoundland ghost stories that people tell me. I love Newfoundland ghost stories. They're funny and they're scary. And you just have to live in Newfoundland, look around you to say, okay, this place is full of ghosts. So that's where my inspiration comes from. How do you choose which of those many images in your mind? How do you choose which picture to draw for each page, really?
I kind of try to force myself down this road where I can create the most fantastical or dramatic scene. So that's where I came up with the smoke and the images that the children are coming up with and seeing from the stories that the men are telling. So I wanted a connective device between the adults and the children, but they almost represented them in a different way. So the smoke was a physical sense where it was coming from the men's pipes or the lamps or the candles that were around in the room, but the children were taking them and turning that into a whole other mysterious kind of piece that it wasn't in the text, which I kind of liked that in my role. I got to elaborate a little bit more. So
Hmm.
I think it says in 2 words, it says pirate ship. So I really pushed that and made a big boat. And there was another scene where it's a beast who turns from a cat to a dog to a howling monster. So I made a big monster scene. In Newfoundland folklore and our culture, we are built on passing down tales and that tradition. So I was just wondering if the ghosts are maybe things that we haven't physically seen or we believe we've seen. Do you think that these tales sort of fall into a fiction or a nonfiction genre?
That's a really interesting question, because the first book I wrote about ghosts, which was called A World Full of Ghosts, they classified it as nonfiction, and I thought that was kind of funny. But it was, that too was a book where I was talking about traditions around the world, but I was also getting people's stories and getting them to tell me the stories. And so I thought it was a vote of confidence for, the argument that there are such things as ghosts. It's good to call it nonfiction. Um, I think with this book, I think I would call it, it's really hard, because I was going to say I'd call it fiction, because I did make up a lot of the stuff. I mean, I had the story, but I did make up a lot of the surrounding part of the story, and what went into it. I kind of reimagined it. So I don't know. Like, I don't know if it actually can be classified as fiction or nonfiction. And I know when kids always ask me if I believe in ghosts, and I do. And I also always tell them that when someone's telling me a ghost story and they believe it, they've seen the ghost themselves. Um, you have to believe them, right? That is their experience. So whether it crosses into fiction or not, that's the reality of their experience. So you have to kind of respect that. And so on some level, to me, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, because if it's true to them, then it's a true story.
Yeah,
So
I would believe that. I feel, especially as Newfoundlanders, family.
yes, that's right. That's right. That's a good argument for calling it nonfiction. Yeah, because and there are too, and that's the thing that I found. Like if when I went into schools and asked the kids for ghost stories, they just came in with so many stories and old stories, and some would be the same story but told a different way. And so yeah, the stories are definitely out there, and people believe them. And I think I got one more question for you, which is, what was your favorite thing, the favorite part of illustrating the book? What was your favorite part of it?
I feel like I really like doing the images of the children, because
Yeah.
they're the part that really made the story come to life. Without them, it would sort of be like background images, but I feel like their facial reactions and expressions are what made it a scary tale, because you were seeing it from their eyes. And I think we can all remember back to being afraid of the basement or afraid of going a certain place in your house, because when you were younger, everything was bigger than you, and it was just scary. Like my mind could go forever.
This has been great. I really love talking to you about this, Jenny. It's so great to see how another artist works in a different field, and also to know what you did go through producing this amazing, beautiful book. So thanks a lot. And
Thanks.
and I guess we'll say goodbye. And I hope I hope everybody enjoys the book as much as we obviously enjoyed working on it. Hi. Hi everybody. Here I am. I'm actually live now. We taped the earlier part a couple weeks ago. But I just like to say welcome to everyone who's tuned in, and apologize for the technical difficulties. Well, I don't know what happened. I hesitate to say this, but I think we might be haunted. We might be haunted. We definitely are a little haunted here in Newfoundland. So thanks for sticking around. And I am going to now answer any questions that anybody has. And I've had people, this is all kind of new to me, but I've been seeing all the comments, and I'd like to welcome everybody, Lana, Ashley, Rebecca, and say hi again to Jenny. And just thanks for everybody who's watching. And I think we were haunted because the time it went out for me was right at the moment when you find out what happens. So obviously, just to let you know, in case you didn't see that part, the telegram says that poor Kay died at 9:10 in the hospital in St. John's. So at the very moment that his footsteps were heard was the moment that he died. So great story. And thanks again to Brian Walsh, the late Brian Walsh, who was the person who told me that story. It was a wonderful storyteller. And nobody could tell it like Brian, have to say. Okay, so now let's see if we got some questions. Any questions? Yeah. So Lana Shoup wrote in something really interesting. I'll just tell you what she said. She said, my mother and her friends used to do quilting bees, and we kids would sit under the quilt table and listen to ghost stories. The scariest story was about the devil coming to the door disguised as a distinguished gentleman. He would sit and have tea, and then after he left, a cloven hoof print in the linoleum under the kitchen table. I always looked for that hoof print. Now, that's really scary that she was sitting under the table and that's where the footprint would appear. So that's a good story. Thanks, Lana. I know there's a lot of stories about the devil leaving in here just up the coast from me. There's a place where you're supposed to be able to see where the devil left a footprint on a rock. Anyway, let's see if we got any questions. Thank you for all your compliments. Yeah. One thing that I was going to, if you have any questions, just write them in. But one thing I was going to say that I was listening to Jenny's, what she was saying about being scared when you're a child and drawing the children. And as she said about being scared of the basement, and I don't know about other people, but my basement was really scary. I was convinced there was a bear, a big black bear that lived in my basement. And it was an old house. And when I would go up the stairs, I would go up on my hands and knees, like really, really fast, helping myself get up, convinced that the bear was behind me the whole way, and I had to run really fast to get away from him. So I just thought I'd share that little fear of the basement with you. Okay, so let's see. We've got a question from Lana. Did you enjoy working on the children's picture book as opposed to your more young reader books? Good question. Because I write novels. I've written 3 now and 4, another one to be published next year. Novels, full-length children's novels for ages 8 to 14 about. And writing a novel that's, 76,000 words is very different than writing a short picture book like this. I really did enjoy writing the shorter ones. It takes a different kind of attention, and it's not. And also because the story was told to me, so the basic story is there, so I don't have to wrestle with the plot the way I do with the novel plots. But it is nice to have something that's more contained, and also having it illustrated is just really exciting. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed doing these picture books, Footsteps in Bay de Verde and The Fairyland Visitor, both published by Running the Goat. And both of them, I got a lot of fun writing. I had a lot of fun writing them. Though I suppose the most fun I had was when people told me the original stories. Okay. See if there's any more. Yeah. Lana mentioned my other book. I have another book coming out later this summer called Screech, Ghost Stories from Old Newfoundland. And like Footsteps, it's 10 traditional Newfoundland stories. It's not there. It's more like a chapter book. Each one has one illustration, but it's the same idea. It's kind of taking a traditional Newfoundland story and reimagining it and using my own sort of details to make the story mine, really. So that's coming out later in the summer. Okay, here's a question. Do you test drive your stories with children? How does that help the process? Good question. Yes, I do test drive them. I go around to schools, and I've actually this fall, if COVID allows me to go again, will be the 12th annual ghost tour of Newfoundland schools. So for 12 years, I've been going every fall, going around to schools, telling ghost stories to the children, telling my Newfoundland ghost stories, talking about my books, doing writing workshops. And these stories, especially Footsteps, I've been telling it for years. It's one of my favorite stories, and it's always very satisfying to tell to a group of children because children love ghost stories. And if you have 125 kids in a room, and I always try and make it dark wherever I am, and they're all just completely quiet, as if a pin could drop and you'd hear it, waiting on every word. And so when I tell it, there's certain places like when the lantern breaks and there's a scream where everybody in the room, all the kids go, it's they all react in a very satisfying way to the scary parts, or they'll scream. And once I had two girls who were screamers. They just screamed. They just started screaming hysterically, all in good fun, of course. And so yeah, I do test drive the stories. I tell them to kids again and again, and I also tell them to grown-ups. I've had many ghost story nights for grown-ups too. And I find that every time I tell the story, something will change a little bit. And the time I told this story, there were a couple of things in that story tonight that have never been there before, just little details. So it's a process, storytelling, and it's a lot of fun. Um, let's see if there's any more questions. I don't see any more coming in. So let me see if I had anything else I wanted to say. I don't think so. I maybe just wanted to say one more thing about Brian Walsh, who told me the original story. He was a great guy, and he died a couple of years ago, and he's so greatly missed by his family and friends, and particularly by me. He just was a very generous person who welcomed me into his home with his wife Doreen and told me stories, and always made me laugh and always scared the hell out of me. I have to say, he really he knew how to make you very scared when he told ghost stories. Okay, here's a question. Well, you've been collecting ghost stories for a while. What makes you choose one to write? Well, that is a good question. As I say, I do go and tell the stories. There was a couple of, I do go and tell them to schools, to kids at schools. So those are the ones I end up writing usually. But in Screech, I chose some other ones. I guess it's partly what captures my imagination. Um, I have a story about ghosts in Push Through that on the south coast of Newfoundland, and there was a haunted house where people would see lights at night. And if you know anybody from Push Through, they'll have heard this story. It was the old Chambers house. There's something about a house that's empty, and then there are lights in it at night moving around behind the windows. I mean, it's so spooky. So that captured my imagination, and I really wanted to write that story. So that was it. It's kind of like if a story really touches me and I can feel the fear of whoever is telling the story, the child is, I always try and make it a child at the center of the story. But I can feel the fear and get a little shiver, then I know that it's a story I want to write. And that's how I choose them. Someone else is asking what makes a good ghost story. Now that's kind of a hard question. I have a ghost story writing workshop I do with kids and grown-ups. And I talk about the different elements that go in, like suspense and working up, waiting until you get to the most exciting part of the story and keeping people in suspense and creating the spooky atmosphere. I mean, those are things that go into every ghost story. But I think what really makes a good ghost story is if it makes you just catch your breath and say, "Oh, how could that happen?" If it gives you a sense of wonder and feeling like something impossible has happened, that's a good ghost story because it's happened and yet it's impossible, and it's that tension between the possible and the impossible. That is the lure of ghost stories for me, and that's what makes a good ghost story. But of course, it has to be scary, and yeah, kind of stop your breath. That's a good ghost story. Oh, and the other thing that's really important is if you know the person that it happens to. So if somebody tells you that their mother saw this ghost, like in this story, it makes it more scary than if somebody tells me about somebody they heard about far away, somewhere else. And the closer the personal contact to the story, the more scary it is. So, you can cheat and say things like, this happened to me. Um, but anyway, we won't talk about that. But if you're telling somebody a ghost story and you're allowed to make stuff up, make it happen to you or someone you know very well, because that always makes it scarier because it makes it more believable. Shh, don't tell. Oh, Kate. Yes, Kate Laidlaw. I've talked to her. She says, I'm a 61-year-old woman who has read all of your novels to my 9-year-old mother, and I live near the necropolis in Cabbagetown, Toronto, too. So my question is, do you think you have any ghosts around you that help you to write your story? Oh, Kate, that's a very, very spooky question. I believe in spirits. I really do. And I believe that spirits of people that I've known and loved come back to me and help me with some kind of with my writing. I think they do support me. Some people I know that are spirits now. I feel that they do come back and help me. Particular ghosts. I feel quite connected to some of the ghosts, like the ghost in this story, poor Kay. I feel quite connected to him. Um, I don't know if he sort of helps me tell the story, but just by the reality of him that is created by telling the story again and again, he exists for me. And yeah, there is something in the ghosts themselves that lend themselves to, they want their story to be told. So yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes. I think we're getting into kind of esoteric territory here, which is fine because it is about ghosts. But Kate says something that's interesting because I do have a lot of people who read my books who are grown-ups, my novels and my stories. I know The Fairyland Visitor was very popular with older women. The publisher Marnie told me that her mother knew there were several women who just really loved the story. Maybe it reminded them of their childhood. I don't know, but I do find older people like my story too, and also reading it aloud. I have another friend who reads it to her mother, who's been in a senior's home in COVID, and she hasn't been able to see her, but she does read her the story over the phone, and that's really nice to know that they're being read aloud. And this story, of course, is very much to be read aloud. Okay. Okay, so someone has said, have you ever been in a seance? Yeah, I have. I have. I think I prefer, they're pretty scary. I prefer my ghosts to come to me when I'm walking around by the ocean or in old haunted houses, but seances can be pretty creepy. Yeah, they say somebody else has said, yeah, that she reads my books and she doesn't have children. So yeah, it's kind of funny because it is children's books do cross over to grown-ups for sure. And someone else's mother loved, I think they mean the Ghost Road there, but yeah, I think that's all the questions. So that might be a good place to stop. Let me just see if my producer is around. Yeah, I think.
I'll get on here now and thank you, Charis. You've done a wonderful job, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. I do believe once I got my husband to stop my daughters from streaming things downstairs, it stopped. I think there was multiple issues going on. So I wanted to thank you for writing the story, for the lovely conversation, and answering all these questions. I'm Michelle Porter, by the way, and I'm with Running the Goat Books and Process.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think I also want to thank Jenny again, because I really enjoyed the conversation with Jenny, and her illustrations were just, they brought to life something in the book that I hadn't even known was there. So I love her illustrations. And so I want to thank her.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that's the end of that. This has been lovely.
Thanks for everything, Michelle. You did a great job.
Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye.